Some anthropologists, and I don't entirely agree with them, but some suggest that our success as a species is also our failure. They, some anthropologists suggest that the human species achieved what it achieved through having an enemy, that enemy being another species. And when we got to the point, as we have done, where we have no natural predator, our instinct is still to make war, even though there's nobody to make war upon. There's no species chasing us. There's no war to fight. The only people we're fighting are ourselves, members of our own species. And some anthropologists will argue that this occurs because of our mindset. We have not yet got to an understanding that we don't have to fight any of those fights anymore.
Thank you so much, Dr. Onyeka Nubia, for joining us today. Onyeka is a pioneer, internationally recognized historian, writer, presenter, who is really reinventing all of our perceptions of the Renaissance, British history, Black studies, and intersectionalism. And is there anything else you would like to say that maybe I've either said incorrectly or you'd like to add?
No, not at all. You've done a fantastic job.
Okay. Onyeka, how did you first become aware of the Berlin Conference, and what is the Berlin Conference?
Okay, fantastic question. I think I must have been about 10 years old, and I was doing some looking at atlases instead of playing in the garden or playing with your school friends. And as I looked at the atlases, I saw all these straight lines in the continent of Africa. Mm-hmm. And I thought, where do these straight lines come from? Usually between countries, the geographical boundaries follow rivers, oceans, deserts, man-made and unman-made obstacles, and they're usually quite organic, in terms of how they're formed and shaped. But in the continent of Africa, lots of straight lines, almost like somebody had taken a ruler and a pencil and drawn a straight line. Oh, that's really strange. Why is continent of Africa like that with all these straight lines? And I thought it was something wrong with the way I was looking at it. There's something wrong with my thought process. So I was about 10 and I thought, okay, I asked my teachers. My teachers didn't really have an answer for me at all about it. So I started to do some investigations, and I think I must have been about 11 or 12 until I got sort of a satisfactory answer that this was because of a conference in which European nations had actually used the ruler to draw straight lines to divide up countries. And I thought, wow, I wasn't far off when I said it looked like it was a straight line, because absolutely they used a ruler to draw these straight lines and to divide these countries and say who got what and what have you. So
before that point,
yeah.
Onyeka, you say these countries, but these weren't countries, were they?
Yeah. Well, some of them were countries and some of them were empires. But some of them made themselves into empires at that conference because they didn't have empires at that point. But some of them were already empires. You're quite right. Would you call the United States of America a country or an empire in 1884?
Probably. I don't know. I guess I'm not sure. That's a complicated question.
Indeed, because they were there. Yeah. They were there. They got a piece of the cake.
Right.
And not a very big piece, but they were there. Yeah. So, I mean, there were countries and there were empires there. Obviously, the big players, Britain, that some people call Great Britain, but I just call it Britain, France, and places like that, big places. And during this conference, they decided who would get what. And Britain and France's main concern was to not let Germany get anything.
Right.
Because Germany was feeling aggrieved because it had been left out of the party. And being a big country in Europe, it wanted to have a big piece of the cake.
Now, do you think they had any mindset about how outrageous this was?
Absolutely not. Just like when Europeans in America decided that they were going to with manifest destiny, decide what the future North American continent would look like. And they decided that, you know, America was made for the European and that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, you know.
Yeah.
When they made these sorts of things, the outrageousness of their statements it's not necessarily visible to them. And I think perhaps even now, there's a complete absence of understanding about the nature of how horrific these things are. And in the same way, when, you know, Cortez and Pizarro and the rest in South America decided that South America would be the playground of European imperialists, same thinking. Or when Europeans decided that they would take over Oceania and drive out the Tasmanian and the Aboriginal people and all the native First Island people and First Nation people in what is now Australia, the thought of the outrageousness of that action also didn't come across European thought processes. So by the time we get to 1884, I think they were kind of used to doing it.
So when we look at this map, you know, we can think that this is dead history in a way, but aren't these things still with us every day? You know, isn't this still affecting our world right now?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because what the European powers did, they had no proper recourse to the independent African peoples who inhabited the continent of Africa. Let's give an example because it's really important to give examples. There's a group of people called the Maasai. The Maasai were an independent nation with a language and a culture and a history going back hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. A very proud people. In many ways, you know, like other peoples that we find in other parts of the world, we know their proud history and what have you. Because they had that proud history of resistance, the European powers decided to split them between 4 different new nations: Ethiopia, Sudan, and Kenya. So now you find Maasai split. They don't have their own nation. They're in Ethiopia, they're in Kenya, and they're in the Sudan. Oh, and they're in Uganda. I'm sorry, 4 different nations. And in some of those places, they are now forced to speak a different language, be it English or whatever. So now they are unable to even communicate because their first language is not on the curriculum, and they now have a new language. But the important thing is that they don't have a nation state or an opportunity to express themselves as a nation state. Now, we might quibble about nationalism and say that nationalism per se is a bad thing, but at least people should have a choice about being part of a state or not. But the Maasai weren't given that choice. And there are so many other peoples like that who found themselves divided between 4 or 5 different nations, mostly those nations then being controlled by a different European power.
So also, then did they begin to war, you know, go to war against themselves? So what was originally, right?
Absolutely.
Now we're creating, and that's of course a power play.
Absolutely.
So,
That's absolutely. That's absolutely. Because let's take a country like Nigeria. Nigeria has over 200 linguistic ethnic nations. It was never one nation, nor probably can it ever be really one nation in the true sense of monoethnicity or whatever. Because in the north, you have a strongly Muslim population. In the south, you have a strong animist Christian population. You have various independent peoples who have been independent for thousands of years and sort of existed or coexisted with their own independence. But the British said, no, put them all together and we'll administer it. Of course, then when they walked away in 1960, all these peoples who had never resolved their issues are now left to try and resolve the mess that's been left behind.
Belgium was particularly egregious. Can you just describe, you know, what they were doing?
Absolutely. At the conference, as I said, the prime concern that Britain and France had was that Germany shouldn't get anything. To prevent Germany from getting something, Belgium took over what was the lion's share, the central prize, which was the Congo Basin. Now, the reason why the Congo Basin was so favored is because it has a region called Katanga. Katanga is probably one of the most mineral-rich places in the world. There's gold there, there's diamonds there, there's oil there, which wasn't directly important initially, but became so. There's, of course, rubber trees, cotton can be grown there, ivory can be grown there. And of course, as we now know, there's uranium there, but that wasn't important to them at that point. But it was a very mineral-rich, and still is a very mineral-rich place, perhaps one of the most mineral-rich places in the world. So the Congo Basin was granted not to Belgium, but personally to Leopold II as his personal gift. This is the most unusual thing in that it wasn't given to a country like the other parts, but directly to Leopold for him to administer directly as he saw fit.
And he was a total maniac. So how did he see fit?
Absolutely brutal and savage. Absolutely brutal and savage. When we think of the brutal, despotic people of the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, Leopold is up there with those individuals. The conservative estimates put that the population of the Congo was destroyed in their millions. Conservative estimates put it at the lowest figure that we have is 3 million. That's the lowest figure. The highest figure is 20 million. And that's between 1885 to 1908. Yeah, between 3 and 20 million. People like Roger Casement, the Anglo-Irish investigator, said 3 million. That's a strongly conservative. George Washington Williams, the African-American correspondent who was sent there to investigate, said it's nearer 20 million. Other scholars, Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, said it's near 10 million. So we're quibbling over millions here.
Yeah. I mean, it's just hard to understand how this could be thought of as a win for the continent in that day by the mindset of any of these nations,
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, Jesse, that the justification for going in was to provide civilization, to spread Christianity, and laughingly, to put an end to the slave trade and enslavement. That's what the overriding philosophy was, despite the fact that Britain and France had helped to start the slave trade in the first place, and that their measures helped to increase enslavement throughout, because that's what they were effectively doing, by introducing effective occupation, which was the term that they used. They were reinstitutionalizing systemic enslavement throughout the entire continent of Africa.
Now this, so they, as Africans spread out around the world, they spread to South America, they spread to North America, to Europe, to
they weren't
Asia.
Spread, they were taken, a lot of them, correct?
But as they move around, what does this pulling of the root mean for those societies around the world and even in Africa? What does it mean, that they're not Africans now? They're from the Congo, they're from Ghana, they're from all these places, but they're not. But the root is gone.
Yeah. So there's a lot of points in what you're both saying. Thank you. There are a number of problems. First of all, when African countries fought and won their independence from 1957 onwards, they won their independence with a broken cup, because they inherited the boundaries and borders from the Berlin Conference. They inherited geographical spaces which were not their own and had been created by colonial powers, and which they found very difficult to manage as their own. So there were inter-ethnic conflicts because these people had been put together by colonial powers. These nations then had to develop an identity which they probably didn't have before. For those people in the diaspora who may look to the continent for identity, they are witnessing the same disunity and confusion because they don't know quite what they're looking at or what they're claiming, because the people inside don't know what they're looking at or what they're complaining. And I know that sounds very arrogant because I'm not in the continent of Africa, but it's true. So initially, many of the Pan-African leaders, people like Kwame Nkrumah and Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba, their idea was to get rid of the boundaries and the borders between states and build a United States of Africa. And the center of it would be the Congo. That was the idea. But the demarcations that people like von Bismarck and others set up was so strong that that generation of leaders were entirely thwarted in their attempts to form that kind of unity. Now, for those people in the diaspora, that causes problems because they may, in the face of living in America, living in Britain, living in France, living in Brazil, want to, either in a physical sense or in a psychological sense, relate to a continent of Africa to form their identity, especially when they face institutional racism, discrimination, and everything else. But when they look to the continent of Africa, sometimes they can't find what they're looking for.
I have a question. Before this conference, was there ever a feeling of the united Africa? What happened? Because it didn't just, it's not like a day and then the powers, what is this erosion or not? Or take us back, please.
Thank you, Priscilla. That's a absolutely fantastic question. Brilliant question. Really good question. So obviously in the time that we have, I cannot give a précis of the entire continent of Africa because the continent of Africa is one of the most diverse continents in the entire world. And its history goes back to the birth of humankind. So I can't give that précis. What I can say is that the continent of Africa has been going through its own processes, both west, east, north, and south. And the process of destabilization didn't start in 1884. It started hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before that. But what the European colonial powers did is take advantage of that destabilization.
You know, when you travel in rural England and you go to parishes and, all the different communities that are there, what do you find there? Because there's a long history of Africans in England. So what's it like when you're traveling in the rural parts of England?
Ironically, in some very rural villages, there is almost a rural identity that is absent of the big picture of race, but is cognizant of the idea of local identity. And if you can be within that local identity, you will be acknowledged as part of that local identity, no matter what you are, if you are part of it. So it isn't necessarily true to say that automatically the rural parts of England are more racist than the towns, although that would be certainly an idea that certain people would purport. It's not necessarily true. There is a lot of racism in London. There's a lot of racism in Birmingham, in Sheffield, in Nottingham, in Leeds, in Liverpool. And there is a lot of historic racism in these places. So it's not true to say that it's just a question that cities are more tolerant than the countryside. That's not true to say. But yes, there is certainly an acknowledgement, probably in Britain, probably outside too, that the question of diversity, or some people think that the question of diversity is only a matter of metropolitan Britain. That in other words, there is only diversity, in London and Birmingham and the major cities. But that's not true. Just like the question of diversity in the United States of America isn't just a question of New York, Miami, Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago, and Atlanta. There are rural communities in Britain, just like there are rural communities in America. Perhaps not as many because the proportion of population is less, but they exist.
Africans have been in England, if we look at Othello, that's, 16, something.
Yeah.
And Othello, and they were there long before that.
Yeah.
We start to see good things and bad things about race there, right? Like,
Absolutely.
what are your thoughts on Othello and how Shakespeare saw race?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question. The African presence in England has been for at least 3,000 years, at least. The conservative estimates, that means since the Romans, and perhaps before then, if you look at the Iberian Celts. We can measure, certainly, from at least the 13th century all the way up till now, an African presence from 1300 all the way up. And we can chart the presence of these people in villages, towns, and cities from the 1300s all the way up till now. We couldn't before, but now we can. That's because of hard work of certain people. Now, this presence hasn't been in the same places at the same time. And because in a different way to the way in which America was in the 19th century, there were not racial laws that divided Africans from Europeans in that same sense. In the early period, before the 18th or 19th century, most Africans integrated and assimilated within white English society. So they actually lost their ethnic distinctiveness. They became assimilated with the population, lost their color, lost their complexion after the third, fourth generation. So I'll give an example. Henry Anthony Jetto lived in Holt in Worcestershire. Now, Worcestershire is an extraordinarily rural place. It's really, really rural. It's like, I'm trying to think of an example, Wisconsin or somewhere like Quebec. It's a very rural place where people may not instinctively think, oh yeah, the Africans are in those places. Of course they're there, just like they're in South Dakota, but people may not think it. So he lived in that place, Holt, a little village in Worcestershire. And he came there in 1597, more than almost 500 years ago. And he got married to a woman called Priscilla. We think that Priscilla was a white English woman. They had 5 children. And then he had one illegitimate child called John Cuthbert. These 6 children went on to have 32 grandchildren and then several hundred great-grandchildren. When Henry Anthony Jetto was described in his record, he's described as a Blackamoore. And of course, the name Jet, described as coming from the word jet, French, meaning black. He's described as a Blackamoore, as black, and as an African in those records. He got baptized in England in 1597. He was 26 years old. He got married to Priscilla a few years later. He was initially a servant, then he became a gardener, then he acquired enough wealth to become a man with independent status. He bought land and became a yeoman. He was entitled to vote and sit on jury trials. This is in 1597. Yeah. And his children populated Holt. This is a man of power and prestige. He wrote his own will, in which he talks about how he wants to distribute his land. He's not the only person. There's someone called Dido Elizabeth Bell. That film called Bell was made about. Dido Elizabeth Bell was the niece of Lord Mansfield. Lord Mansfield was the judge that ruled in the Somerset case on enslavement in the 18th century. Dido Elizabeth Bell was a woman of dual heritage, a woman of African descent and dual heritage. And she inherited much of the wealth that came from her father and from Lord Mansfield. She was a woman of wealth and prestige and status in 18th century British society. There's someone called Nathaniel Wells who lived in Monmouth, which is in Wales. He was also of dual heritage, and he became a man of wealth and prestige. Now, when I say everything that I've just said, I'm not trying to detract away from the horrors of enslavement that were taking place in the 18th century at this same time. But what I am saying that in Britain, in the 18th century, there were Africans who had managed to obtain position within British society and became independently wealthy and had independent status, men, women, and sometimes even children. And these people can be found throughout English history, going back all the way to the Roman times. In the Roman period, there is the famous ivory bangle lady who lived in Britain 2,000 years ago. This was an African woman of prestige and status living in Roman Britain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So wait, I mean, to me, everything, it goes back to you as the 10-year-old. What did the teacher tell you? You're asking these questions. And what I'm hearing is yes, we have the horrors, and then we have to surface all the incredible stories. And that's really, kind of what the reckoning is right now, at least in the United States. That's the question. What is education? Who is monopolizing it? Who's telling the story? And what stories must be told? So that moving forward, we are given a much richer, fuller view of the.
I mean, Russia's greatest poet, Pushkin, was African.
Absolutely. And Pushkin's a very good example, because Pushkin's, of course, great-grandfather was Ibrahim Petrovich Ganable. And Major General Ibrahim Petrovich Ganable, my mistake. And Ibrahim Petrovich Ganable came from Chad or Ethiopia. There's a debate about which. I actually think that he came from Chad. And he was originally a servant to Peter the Great before rising in rank to become Major General in the Russian Empire. And his descendants, all of them, including Pushkin, and including one of his other descendants called Abraham Ganable. Abraham Ganable was an admiral in the Russian Navy. He was in charge of the entire Russian Navy. This whole family, Pushkin's whole family, is remarkable, absolutely remarkable, like the Dumas family in France. They are remarkable. The Dumas family in France, including Alexander Dumas and his father, Thomas Dumas. Now, Thomas Dumas was born in Haiti, in the Caribbean, and his original name was Alexander Palantiri. His father was a French nobleman, and his mother's name was Dumas. He adopted his mother's name when he came to France, and there were few avenues for him to progress. So he joined the army, and he joined the army as a private. He rose up every rank until he became the equivalent of Major General Thomas Dumas. He is probably one of the most important figures of the Enlightenment within the French military, and interacted with people like Voltaire, with people like Napoleon, and yet has been removed from that history, or part of his removal was by Napoleon, actually. So Thomas Dumas helped to even expand the French Empire and sat on the cusp between revolutionary France and when France became an empire under Napoleon. And he actually resisted Napoleon's rise to power, which is why he got written out of history. Thomas Dumas was a remarkable person with a remarkable life. There used to be a statue to Thomas Dumas in Paris that used to sit in the center of Paris. And when the Nazis arrived there in 1941, they saw the statue to this black man. And they lost their minds. The Nazis lost their minds and totally destroyed the statue. They said, we're not having this in the middle of Paris. So the Dumas family are another family of remarkable people. And these sorts of families are to be found throughout Europe, Renaissance Europe, and even afterwards.
So at the end of World War I, there's another one of these things where they split up, Syria, they make these countries, they draw these lines, and then, the American government decides, we're going to get rid of these countries, and the destruction of Syria sets in motion this huge voyage of people up from Africa into Europe. Now, why do we see systemic racism and fear of people traveling? What's the long, tail of this conference and what we're living with today, and where do we go from here? How do we mitigate it?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Our ideas are shaped by, there is a phrase in England called, I don't know if you use it here, called NIMBY.
Don't know
you've
that.
heard of it. NIMBY. NIMBY is an acronym. NIMBY means not in my backyard.
Right.
So in other words, it's saying, yeah, there can be things happening elsewhere, somewhere else, in some other place, but not in my backyard. And so we see things on TV and film and video in documentaries, and we say, oh, that's terrible. Oh, that's awful. But what we also do is we become desensitized to it unless it affects us directly. But then when it begins to affect us directly, we become afraid because of what we've already seen. We don't know it, but we become afraid of it because we think we know what's going to happen next. So the fear of the stranger, the fear of the other arises from that notion of not knowing, but fearing that you do know.
You know, in Hungary, they're shutting the borders. And it always, me and Priscilla have worked there quite a bit, and it always struck me that the people who live there, because it's a little further back, don't know how hard it was to open them. You know, and when we think about democratic processes or countries, one of the most important things is freedom to travel. You know, freedom to travel. Like, you know, this lack of borders, shutting things in Europe. You know, what's your thoughts on where does
Brexit.
that all? Yeah, Brexit. You know, pull us away. You know, what does that do to us? You know.
Well, Brexit occurs because of that NIMBY philosophy, because of that idea. I don't want this to happen in my backyard. It's about drawing up the ladder. It's about closing the boundaries. It's about building the wall, you know. And if it's not the physical wall, it's the psychological wall. And what happens is that when you do that as a nation, you give rise to racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, sexism. They all these ideas proliferate because you've created an incubator where they can. You created an environment where people now feel, okay, this is my little space. I want to define who lives here. You don't belong here. You don't belong here. You don't belong here. I belong here. You don't. And people then look at each other and start quantifying whether they belong.
You know, this is super clear with the Roma, where they say this, and even though they've been in Europe in force for, you know, since the 15th century.
Absolutely.
you know, do you understand racism or the thought that someone's skin makes them more valuable or less valuable to a group, or their sexuality, or any of these things? Do you understand it?
Understand it from an historical perspective, yes, because I have to as an historian. I mean, I am predominantly an early modern historian, which I look at the period from 1485 to about 1800. That's my principal area of concern. And that's the period when, in Europe in particular, Europeans moved from a more, I won't say open, ambivalent perspective on ethnicity and even on gender, to then having fixed agendas on gender and on ethnicity as ethnicity became race. And then they reduced everything down to a scientific equation. At the moment when they did that scientifically, Charles Darwin, Erasmus Darwin, and these other people, Charles C. Knott, Charles Benedict Davenport in the United States of America, when they began to do that, they gave birth to race as a concept, end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century, into the 19th century, and then scientific racism. And scientific racism is also connected to a lack of gender fluidity, because in the 15th century, no matter what we may feel about the 15th century, there was actually opportunities for people to move across certain gender boundaries. Custom and tradition were there, but there wasn't a science that was keeping people in place. But in the 18th and 19th century, they were now saying it is scientific. My prejudice can be scientifically proved. There is a science to my prejudice, and this is why we need to do it. This isn't just a question of religion and theology, although that had always been there. It's a question of science. And science isn't about emotion, it's about, and that's when, with that scientific perspective, we have the genesis of the most extreme forms of xenophobia from the 1800s onwards.
Now, is that the downside of the scientific method right there?
Yeah, yeah, because it claims to be objectively and empirically provable. It claims a dispassionateness. It claims, just like the fascists with their eugenics philosophy. They claim, oh, it's nothing to do with us. It's just that can be proved scientifically. Just like those who believed who took the curse of Ham and turned it into the science of race. They believe that, yes, actually, Africans are closer to the animal, that they are bestial, etc. And these sorts of ideas claimed a dispassionate perspective to them, when in fact, of course, they don't have that.
Now, shouldn't that at some point be retired from thought and moved on to, more progressive? I'm not even talking about, it clearly isn't, but it just strikes me as odd that this idea persists and we can't see, at least here in America, we cannot get past it,
Yeah. Jesse, it resides not only in our consciousness, but in our subconsciousness. It resides, we all have an aspect of it. I know I do. Legacies of prejudice and ignorance and indifference. I have it inside of me. I know. And I feel that almost every other human being does. We have it. We inherit from our education and political and cultural systems all these sorts of notions. And even those of us that may claim an enlightened perspective, we still have our prejudices, which we're trying to eradicate and get rid of. Now, there are other people who don't share our drive and support their own prejudices. They enjoy their own bigotry, and the religious systems that they are part of may also support it. The political parties that they are part of may also support it. The education or lack of education that they may receive may also support that. So they're not even on the journey of trying to overcome their own issues. They're wanting to endorse their own issues. That's the worrying thing. And I've got friends and colleagues who may describe themselves as being part of various ethnicities or no ethnicity at all, who may describe themselves as being one gender or another gender or gender fluid, who are various religions or no religion, and who have various ideas and political beliefs. Within my circle of very diverse friends and colleagues, I think that our interactions are not entirely usual. Yeah, because we will disagree with lots of different things. And some of our discussions will be very, very heated. Some of my colleagues and friends are quite right-wing, and we challenge each other on their politics and perspectives. But most people work in the circle of their familiar. And the circle of their familiar, within that circle, they are endorsed by people of the same ideologies, beliefs, cultural systems as themselves entirely. They don't step outside it. So how are they going to meet the challenge? Those poor, unfortunate, deluded people who storm the Capitol, right, feel that they have a political, religious, and cultural right to defend America and do what they do to defend America. And that's because they work within the circle of their familiar.
If John Locke were here today, would he understand where we are and what's happening? Would this be alien to him? The one of the main thinkers of the Enlightenment?
Yeah, I don't know, because as I'm sure you're both aware, the Enlightenment has some unfortunate elements to it. If you're a feminist historian, you will say, well, what Enlightenment? It didn't reach me as a woman.
Right.
If you're someone of African descent, you'll say, well, what Enlightenment? It didn't reach me as a person of African descent. And so it goes on. If you're working class, you say, well, what Enlightenment? It didn't reach me as a working class person, be you male, female, or what ethnicity you are. So these Enlightenment thinkers, like the Thomas Jefferson, the Hobbes, the Locke. When you look down the litany of the incubated prejudice that they also manifested. You say, well, which enlightenment? But nevertheless, there are some principles which they espouse. We see them in the American Constitution. The idea that all men are created equal and endowed with the Creator with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I kind of, it's off. I got it off pat in my head. These are how highfalutin, high-sounding ideas are entirely admirable if you define man as mankind without a gender. They are
but don't we have to, and don't we need every person to work towards happiness?
Absolutely.
The pursuit of happiness, at least the desire to get there.
Absolutely, we do, and we have to try and find common ground, common perspectives, and sometimes it's hard work. I mean, I've worked with lots of different people with lots of different ideas, and it can be really hard work, hard going. Some people say the highest. I wouldn't agree with this, but a lot of people, some people say that the highest thing that we can do on this planet is go to Mars. And I can think of a lot of people I want to be on that spaceship. But the point is that, does it give us a greater? Do we need to be able to look further to what we can all accomplish together to keep our society going? Because we have to fight this battle today and now, but we also have a lot to accomplish for our children and their children. I mean, how do you see the future battles? Indeed. Some anthropologists, and I don't entirely agree with them, but some suggest that our success as a species is also our failure. Some anthropologists suggest that the human species achieved what it achieved through having an enemy, that enemy being another species. And when we got to the point, as we have done, where we have no natural predator, our instinct is still to make war, even though there's nobody to make war upon. There's no species chasing us. There's no war to fight. The only people we're fighting are ourselves, members of our own species. And some anthropologists will argue that this occurs because of our mindset. We have not yet got to an understanding that we don't have to fight any of those fights anymore. We don't have to do that anymore. That conflict is done. Rightly or wrongly, the other species have been pushed to such an extent that we have no fear of them. But our mentality is still there. That mentality of looking for an enemy. We need an enemy. We need a common enemy. Why do we need a common enemy? It's our philosophy that needs to change. Yeah. Our philosophy as a species needs to change.
Are you optimistic that we'll do it? A lot of times these things, well, most times they take a lot of times. A lot of times we look at transitions to democracy and we say, well, it hasn't happened, but maybe that takes a long period of time to occur. If we put some things on the church and we put a list of things on there, it may take a long time for them to be implemented, but it can change. Doesn't mean it will, but it could change. Luther put those things up there.
The Wittenberg, and all that. Yes.
So do we have a chance? What do you think?
I hope so. I think so. I hope so. I hope that we can come to that understanding. I think that none of us can be complacent. I think that there's this idea of cancel culture, which we need to question. We are all fallible, and we all make mistakes. And we shouldn't necessarily automatically be cancelled on the basis of our mistakes. We should be helped and educated through our errors. Not cancelled. And then there is the other aspect where there are people who are more entrenched in their ignorance. So they're not about reading more and studying more. They're about entrenching what they feel they already know. And that's dangerous, I think. And it's about how one reaches across the aisle and makes a friend perhaps with somebody else. How one shares a perspective with an antagonistic voice or an antagonistic hearer, and opens one's perspective to what they have to say. We don't necessarily have to agree with them, but you open up your perspective to it, because what you have to say may also impact on them. You know, and I think that's the key. That's certainly what I do.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I think that is that's exactly what we all should strive for. It's really hard. I don't even, and I love hearing about your diverse friends and colleagues, and really critical thinking, rigorous dialogue, conversation. I mean, all of it. So to leave the audience, these are really difficult and perplexing and big thoughts that you're bringing up with us that we need to hear. And so I think what's really important is also, as we end this session, what you just said is, what can we do? What must we do? We have to be able to have a conversation. We have to, be more inclined to reach out and listen and try to engage, because I think that is really the only way forward with a very complicated back.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Onyeka, thank you so much for spending time with us today. It's tremendously good, important conversation. And, I hope you'll come back and talk with us more. Really appreciate your time today.
I'd love to. Thank you for having me.